I'm an explorer and a gear geek. I'm always on the lookout for what's the best piece of kit for any given task. If something isn't doing it for me, it's gone. I've tried a lot of gear. I'm not a collector. Everything I have has a role in either my music making or music playing workflows. Because of this, I've developed some very strong opinions on what I like and don't like, what works for me and doesn't, and what's worth spending my money on and earning a place in my world. These impressions come from the perspective of a working live electronic music performer and music producer, regularly releasing tracks and performing internationally for the past 15 plus years. This is not a deep dive technical tutorial. I watched Loop Hop and Red Beans Recording and Cuckoo and Dave Mack and EasyBot for those, just like I'm sure you all do. This series is about sharing my opinions and insights from using the gear to actually produce and perform music professionally, in the hope that they'll help you make better decisions on what will work best for you. These are my thoughts on gear acquisition syndrome. What is G.A.S? We hear people talking about it all the time, particularly on synthesizer videos and drum machine videos. What I think G.A.S is an uncontrollable or unhealthy urge to get more gear that you either don't need or you can't afford. G.A.S is especially prevalent in the synth and drum machine world, but it does exist everywhere. So first, my initial thoughts on G.A.S. With all of the new gear that's come out recently, particularly the Elektron Syntakt that has had all the buzz, including on this channel, there's been a lot of discussion of G.A.S and gassing for things. I was talking with some people on Discord the other day, and they were teasing me about my videos and called me the gas man because I'm pushing people to buy stuff. And actually, I like to think that what I'm doing is pretty far from that. I'm trying to keep people from buying things that they don't need and help steer them towards things that may be helpful. And that got me started thinking, is all excitement over a piece of gear gas? Is there good gas? Bad gas? And what's the difference between the two? Is knee-jerk hate for gear any better than knee-jerk love for it? In my book, any kind of hate is bad. I also got started thinking that isn't the reason that we're into synthesizers because we're not just musicians. We like technology and we like doing fun, new, creative things with it. Being inspired by an instrument's capability or technological advances is powerful, and tinkering is fun. And all of that contributes to our desire for something. After all, doesn't part of the pleasure of making music come from the pleasure of the experience of actually playing the instrument? So let's talk a little bit about bad gas versus good gas. First of all, in my opinion, bad gas starts with wanting something just because it's new. That's consumerism, and not necessarily very well thought out. I also think another form of bad gas is wanting something just because somebody told you to. There's all sorts of channels like this online that will tell you this is good, this is bad, but always keep in mind that it really comes down to what's right for you. And what's right for you may not be the same as what's right for the person whose video you're watching or whose music you admire. Being peer pressured into buying things just because all the cool kids are doing it is never a good thing. You need to make whatever is the best decision for you and your needs. Another type of bad gas that I see all the time is people wanting something to fix a shortcoming of theirs rather than putting in the time to improve themselves. Probably one of the worst types of gas is the gas that leads you to buy something that you can't afford. If you can't afford it, don't buy it. Either save up for it or sell something for it or reevaluate whether or not you actually need it. Another type of bad gas that I see often is buying something that will actually take away from their music making. Learning something totally new from scratch when they're already pretty good at something else that could achieve basically the same result can be really detrimental to the end product of making music. And finally, something else about bad gas is no new gear will make you a better musician. The only thing that will do that is practice and mastering your craft. Next, let's talk about the good forms of gas, the type of excitement that leads you to find out more information about something and have a real motivation and a real drive to get something for a positive reason. And keep in mind, the more of these positive things that overlap on a particular piece of gear, the better that particular piece of gear is for you. The first one is when a product fills a need or contributes positively to your workflow. Like for example, a sequencer that can maybe sequence all of the gear in your studio from one spot. That might make your workflow much easier and much quicker than going from instrument to instrument, sequencing each individual thing. The second type of good gas for a product is for inspirational products. Something that maybe has a really unique sound or an interesting creative workflow, or maybe the user interface is something that's really different and unique, so it inspires you to create in a new and different way. I think a couple of good examples of this would be the Arturia Polybrute or the Moog Subharmonicon. Two things that have inspirational sounds, unique workflows, and creative ways to interact physically with the music that you're making. The next positive reason for getting a new piece of gear is for a collection or an investment. There's a lot of people that collect old vintage instruments, for example, and they know that they're going to hold value. And in the meantime, it's kind of like a savings account that you can play with. So it's something that you can get some love and some enjoyment and some creativity out of, but at the same time, you know that it's a good investment and that those collections can be a positive thing. Next would be something that you might want to get for sentimental value. Like for me, my first ever synth was a Yamaha SY77. So I have that on my short list of synths that when one of them pops up for the right price online, I'm going to get it and add it to my collection. Not for any practical reason, but just because hearing those presets brings me back to the place where I was very first learning how to use synthesizers. That same sentimental value might also come from a synth or a drum machine or a particular piece of gear that has a sound that inspires you because of music that it was used on in the past, that give you a really good, positive, sentimental feeling. Another thing to use in determining whether or not a piece of gear is worth your money, if it has a user interface that makes making music more fun and it motivates you to actually sit down and use it and play it and make music. Next, let's talk a little bit about when, how, and why to buy something, and then also when and why not to buy something, and how you might make up your mind between the two. I think a big reason that somebody might want to buy something is if they're actually a working musician, basically a producer or a performer that's making money off of making music, getting that new piece of gear that will help them do that in a more productive or more creative way gives it a positive ROI, a positive return on their investment, because they'll actually get money from buying this thing. The next one is, as we mentioned before, collection or investing in something. You know, if you can buy something that is a collector's item at a good price, if it comes up far below what you know what it would normally be, that'd be a good investment that you can buy and hold on to it. Or you can actually use it while you're holding on to it and while it's appreciating in value. There's a great quote by one of my favorite producers out there, Gavin Lynch, Matador from Ireland. And he talks about his synth collection, and he has quite an amazing collection of vintage and modern synths, all of which he uses in his productions and in his studio. And he uses the analogy of a writer. He said, if you're a writer, how many pens would you have? Or how many pieces of paper would you have? And it's kind of the same. As a musician, these synths, these drum machines, these instruments are our paper and pen that we use to create. And I like to think of it as paints. I look at creating improvisational music like painting. And for me, if you're a painter or an artist, how many tubes of paint would you have? Even though a couple of tubes look exactly the same on the outside, they may have a totally different color inside. They may be something that inspires you or that you need for a particular project. How many brushes would you have? Would you only use a big brush, only a small brush? Of course you wouldn't. You would have particular things that would serve a particular purpose. But that doesn't mean that you need 100 tubes of the same red paint. That would be a waste. Another thing that I look at when I'm deciding whether or not to buy something is it an upgrade from something that I already have? And if it is, I'll probably sell that thing that I already have. Now let's talk about when and why not to buy new gear. First and foremost, if you can't afford it, don't go into debt just to buy the latest and greatest thing, whether it's a synthesizer or a drum machine or a pair of shoes or a car or whatever. Don't buy that latest and greatest thing if you can't afford it. I would also say don't buy something new if you've already got something in your setup that does the same thing, unless you're either planning to sell that thing or you're planning to collect. Next, I would avoid buying things if you don't have an actual reason to buy them. There's a great book about hospitality in the restaurant business called Setting the Table, and the author, Danny Myers, talks about the process of deciding what goes on a menu or what doesn't go on a menu. And he always puts it through two filters. It has to have a reason for being there, and it has to be the best version of it that you can get. And I would say when you're thinking about buying a new piece of gear, put it through those same two filters. Does it have a reason that you're buying it? Will it serve a purpose in your setup? And that purpose could be mechanical, or it could be fun or inspirational, but does it serve a purpose? And next, is it the best version of it that you can get? The best version that you can afford? And if it's not the best version, maybe it's better to wait and save up a little bit more or sell something else so that you can get the thing that's the best version of that. And that will keep you from wanting to constantly upgrade and change out your gear if you have things that you know are the best at what they do. Finally, I would say I would avoid buying gear if you already have a bunch of unused gear. In that case, my advice would be try to fall back in love with the gear you have, or sell some of it off to be able to get the things that you want. But you don't just want a whole bunch of instruments sitting around collecting dust. They'd be much better off with somebody who's going to actually get some positive use out of them. So what are some positive ways to make that final decision on whether or not to get something? Ask yourself, what's the purpose for buying that thing? Ask how it will fit in your workflow, what it'll be for. I would avoid trying to get a whole bunch of all-in-one gear. There are a lot of groove boxes out there lately that all do a lot of overlapping and similar things, and having more of them isn't always a good thing. A small number of them is great for what they actually do. When you need something all-in-one, convenient and portable that you can use to make all sorts of music in one box and one machine, then you found something really great. But there's no reason to have multiples of those things. Having multiple multi-tools is rarely as effective as having one of each of the tool that specializes in each of those things. Another factor that I would use to decide whether or not to get something is find an ecosystem or a workflow that suits you and the type of music you make and the way you make music, and stick with that rather than switching from company to company, workflow to workflow all the time and having to relearn something new completely from scratch. And then when you use another instrument in your collection, you have to relearn that one. And when you get comfortable with that and you switch back to another, you have to relearn that because you forgot everything that you learned anyway. Some good examples of this where workflow transfers from machine to machine is within the Elektron workflow, which I particularly like. I know there's a lot of people also that really like the MPC workflow. If you're comfortable with a workflow like Elektron or MPC or Machina or something like that, stick with that unless you have a really good reason to switch, because the time wasted learning an entirely new system and an entirely new way to work is time that you're not actually making music. There is something to be said for the creative inspiration of doing things in a different way, and that's all good, but just make sure it isn't detracting too much time from your music making. I would also say avoid getting gear that you won't use for your particular workflow or your particular type of music that you make. As I mentioned before, I make techno music, and there's not a lot in the particular style that I make of polyphonic synthesizers, and I'm not a great keyboard player, so having a whole bunch of polyphonic synthesizers wouldn't make a lot of sense for me. However, a lot of the music that I make is sequenced on monophonic synthesizers, so having monosynths and sequencers is something that does add constructively to my workflow and the type of music that I make. If you are into sample-based music and sampling other instruments or other recordings and chopping samples and flipping samples and finger drumming, then you probably are going to want to work on something more like the Machina or the MPCs. If you are a great keyboard player and you enjoy playing two-handed polyphonic chords and things like that, then having multiple polyphonic synths with different voices that offer creative ways to make the type of music and the style that you play would be great. I think we all have to get away from trying to want every piece of gear to do everything all in one. Sometimes there's something to be said about a specialist. A Subsequent 37 doesn't have to be a sampler because it's such a good synthesizer. And an Octatrack doesn't have to have a synth engine because it's such a good sampler and resampler and effects machine. Finally, gear acquisition syndrome is a natural reaction to things that we are excited about in this creative art of music making. It can be bad and it can be good, and we have to consciously try to control the bad and focus on making good decisions with the gear that we do get. On this channel, I try my best to help you evaluate things in a way that will help you decide whether or not something is right for you, whether or not it's worth spending the money on, and whether it should earn a spot in your particular workflow. I'll never tell you to get something just because I like it, but I will also let you know if I like something and if I don't. If you're enjoying this video, I'd really appreciate it if you could give it a like down below and maybe leave a comment. It makes the algorithm happy and it makes this video visible to a lot more people out there. And if you'd like to support the channel, there's a couple different ways that you can do that. There's a link below to my Patreon, and you'll get some downloads to my live jams and some sample packs that I'll be making with some of my instruments coming up here pretty soon. And there's also some affiliate links down in the description below to all of the gear that I use. And if you click on any of those links and you decide to purchase something, a small portion of that does come back and help support the channel, and it doesn't cost you anything additional. But most importantly, I just appreciate you taking the time out of your day to hang out for a little while. The fact that you choose to watch these videos is amazing, and I really appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks so much for choosing to spend a little time with me today, and I hope to see you in the next video. Until then, take care of each other.